as usual. Today we're going to do a whirlwind tour of the world. We're going to do a lot of information thrown at you. Like on Monday's lecture, I might not get to every term on the slides because I'm kind of trying to cover as much as I can. But I'll get to you. This is going to be again another Sports Center history class. You know, I don't know if you ever watch Sports Center on ESPN where they boom 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 show every important game that happened that day like in 10 seconds. You know, it's going to be kind of like that. World history has been kind of like that because if you really get into history, you discover that what you cover in a survey class just kind of scratches the surface. That once you start to look at individual periods and start to look at the history, you find a lot more. If you like history, you find a lot more under the surface than can even be touched in a survey course such as this. So, anyway, with that said, let's get going. All right, we're going to start with China. And when we last left China, China was in disarray following the collapse of the Han Empire. But the Han Empire, and then you saw that there were numerous attempts by different regimes to set up, to revive the Han Empire that were unsuccessful. And so a number of centuries went by, but the next time that China was united, the next time that both the Yangtze River in the south and the Yellow River in the north were joined together under a single regime was by a man by the name of Sui Wen-ti, who founded the short-lived Sui dynasty. You really can't see it, but there's an ancestral picture of Sui Wen-ti. This was in 589 AD. Now, Sui Wen-ti, he was a man of Turkish descent. Remember, following the collapse of the Han Empire, all these tribes from the steppes of Asia had invaded China, and Sui Wen-ti was descended from these Turks who had invaded China from the steppes of Asia. But like many cases in history, over time these Turks adopted Chinese culture and civilization as their own. So he was Chinese in culture, but Turkish in ancestry. Now, the Sui dynasty united both north and south, and it only lasted for 2 emperors. But it was a very significant dynasty in the sense that they united China by military force, and it was a very repressive regime in the sense that they demanded huge taxes and labor from the people of China, and it was one of the benefits of this was that it saw the construction, for example, of much of the Great Wall of China. They really, remember, this wall goes back to the first emperor of the Qin dynasty, but construction really took off. Remember, that was being of Turkish ancestry, they knew how dangerous the steppes of Asia could be and how these tribes presented a threat to China. So they really put a lot of emphasis on building this great fortification wall to protect China's northern border from steppe nomads. Also, the Grand Canal, this great canal was built to connect the Yangtze River in the south with the Yellow River in the north. It was one of the great construction feats in world history, this huge canal that linked these two river systems and united China. And the Grand Canal still is in operation today. So it was, the work must have been tremendous, excavate all the soil and build this Grand Canal. But you see, the problem is that they were never that popular. Peasants really don't like forced labor that much. And Sui Wen-ti's son, his name was Yang, you don't have to know that, but his son didn't have his father's gift of keeping people in check. And during the reign of his son, China had some disasters. There were some losses to nomads that were some military defeats that made the regime look bad. And then there was some natural disasters, floods and famines that resulted in the deaths of peasants. And so, remember, in Chinese culture, the emperor is supposed to have the mandate of heaven. The emperor is supposed to be beloved of the gods. And so when natural disasters strike and when the regime is embarrassed by military defeats, that made the people think that this Sui dynasty had lost the mandate of heaven, that they'd lost the favor of the gods. And so during the reign of the Emperor Yang, the second Sui emperor, there were peasant uprisings. The peasants didn't like this emperor anyway because of all the heavy taxes and labor services. So there were all these rebellions. Now eventually the last Sui emperor was assassinated, and there was a power struggle among the different generals. But eventually a man by the name of Li Wan, who was a general, he was actually related by marriage. Well, he was related to the last emperor. He was a relative of the last emperor's wife, the empress, and he was able to take charge and become emperor. And he, Li Wan, was the founder of the Tang dynasty. Now, the Tang dynasty would be much more long in length. You know, it would last almost 300 years. And the Tang dynasty, now the Tang dynasty was also made up of people of Turkish ancestry. Now, in the Tang dynasty, what you have is a system where you had an aristocracy that was made up of Turkish Chinese, Turco-Chinese. These were people who were Chinese in culture but of Turkish ancestry, and they made up the elite. And in the Tang dynasty, in the system that was set up, the Tang dynasty, these elites, these aristocrats, they controlled all the highest positions in the government. They had a monopoly of power. And they also controlled their own land. They owned their own, they had title, essentially, to their own property. Now, that was not the case with all the other people of China. The vast majority of the ethnic Chinese all their land was technically the property of the emperor. And what would happen was that the emperor and his staff would allocate land to all the people and peasants of Japan. I'm not Japan, China, sorry. And they would allocate all this land, and the way it would work would be that when you were allocated a piece of property, you could farm that land for a certain number of years, and you could even purchase other people's property, but at periodic intervals, all the land was taken up again by the state and redistributed to everybody. So even if you had acquired the land of your neighbors over a period of time, after a set number of years, the state would come in and redistribute the land. They did this because they knew in years past that when people accumulated land at the expense of others, that created social tension and often led to powerful landowners dominating local politics. So they wanted to prevent that. That's why they had the system of redistribution set up, where every interval of years you have this redistribution of land. Now, also, all the people of China, except for the aristocratic elite, all the people of China also had to pay taxes in kind. They didn't have a monetary system. They had to pay in rice or millet, or agricultural products. And they also were required to do heavy, intensive labor. So taxes were paid in kind, and they were also paid in labor services, working on irrigation canals, building fortifications, making sure the canals were all working. So that kind of labor was expected. All right. Now, another thing about the Tang Dynasty was that, like I said, the highest positions were reserved for the aristocracy, but they still had the Confucian system. Remember, they were still heirs of the legacy of the Han Empire. So in the Tang Dynasty, all the lower positions in the bureaucracy were based on merit. And everybody who wanted to go and become a bureaucrat had to go and get a Confucian education and become a shunzu, a scholar gentleman, and go through all that very difficult learning process of learning the classics of Chinese literature, learning about etiquette and poetry and about the gods, and you have to go through this intensive period of training. And then positions in the bureaucracy were based on how well you did on these very competitive examinations that were held. Now, one new wrinkle that the Tang brought into the bureaucracy was that they set up a system where the military and the civilian positions were separate. So in the Chinese government, there were two tracks. One track would be completely a military career, and these military men only had charge of armies. They didn't have civilian duties. And then you had a civilian branch that collected the taxes. So that was a pretty smart idea, to have the people who in charge of the military not have any charge of any money. So the people who were in charge of the money and had access to funds they didn't have any military force. And the people who had the military didn't have any money. So it was a system that allowed for balance, so that you didn't have government officials who could accumulate both military power and money. So it was a way of ensuring that the central government would be in charge. Now, they also had a new wrinkle, in addition, was that you had a third branch of government called the censorate. That's I don't know what the Chinese word for it would be, but the censorate was a branch of the bureaucracy whose job was to keep both other branches, the military and civilian branches, in check. So the censorate's job was to do audits, basically. Every official was inspected. Every official had to give an account of their operations and of their job. And it was the job of the censorate to inspect and to make sure that the other two branches were doing their job. Now this system of government, where you had a civilian and military branch and the censorate, this system of bureaucratic system would remain in place in China, believe it or not, all the way up until the 20th century. It wouldn't be until the early 20th century that China would adopt a Western-style system of bureaucratic system. So this was I guess, saying, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. This system worked for China. In fact, Europeans, when they first started to visit China, extensively in the 17th and 18th century, were very impressed by the Chinese bureaucratic system. Now, the Tang Dynasty early on was very effective. They had good rulers. One way that they dealt with the steppe nomads was to conquer them. And during the time of the Tang Dynasty, the Chinese armies expanded deep into Central Asia to try to get control over the steppe peoples, the various Turkish tribes that inhabited places like Tajikistan and Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan and all those stands in Central Asia. But they were stopped. Remember, we mentioned this earlier, at the Battle of Talas in 751 AD, Arab armies defeated the Chinese, and that opened up Central Asia to Arab and Muslim influence. And so that's one reason why Central Asia went Muslim rather than Chinese in culture, was because of that epic battle in the middle of the 8th century AD. So that put a brake on further Chinese expansion into Central Asia, that defeat by the Arabs and the victory of the Muslims over the Chinese. Now the thing about the Tang, though, was over time they suffered from the same disease that other Chinese dynasties had suffered from, was that the emperors became increasingly weak and ineffective. And remember, there was the whole system where you had a huge harem, and you had the emperor would have multiple wives and concubines, and you had this competition to see which woman would be the favorite of the emperor and be the dowager empress and the mother of the future emperor. And it was an environment that was very unhealthy for young children. Most of these children, the only male figure in their lives would be eunuchs, the castrated men who served as servants in the harem. And often what happened is that these emperors over time, they appointed eunuchs, these servants, to be their chief advisors. And these servants really had no training or had experience in government, and they were more concerned with living a luxurious lifestyle than actually governing China. So as over time the Tang emperors became more and more ineffective, that created a huge gulf, because you had all these experienced military and civilian officials running the government, yet at the center you had a very weak and ineffective emperor. And so the result would be that military men often would become powerful warlords who would exercise authority in their own name, because the emperor at the center in the central government was so weak. Well, by the 8th century, by the 9th century, by the 800s, China was once again under threat from steppe nomads, and this created a situation where there wasn't any kind of really the government didn't have any credibility because the emperors were so weak. And so what happened is that the military generals took it upon themselves to take charge. And so in 907 AD, the Tang Dynasty was overthrown, but then these generals could not agree among themselves which one of them would be the next emperor. So the result was that China was thrown into about 50 plus years of civil war. as rival generals try to assume the throne. There's a lot of great Chinese movies that are made. If you get on Netflix, you can see all these like foreign movies that are available through Netflix, and they're all these Chinese movies based on like these events. I mean, they're all like martial arts movies. They're really funny. But anyway, they'll have the little subtitles on the bottom. But anyway, now so they had this big civil war. Now during the Civil War, what happened was that the entire system of redistribution was destroyed, and also it destroyed and just utterly destroyed the system of monopoly that the old elite aristocracy used to have. So basically, these civil wars destroyed the aristocracy and destroyed the previous system of redistribution. Now, eventually, what would happen would be that you'd have one general that would defeat all the others, and you have the foundation of the Northern Sung Dynasty, beginning in 960 A.D. Now, it's called the Northern Sung Dynasty because it was based up in the north, but it united all of China. But now China was only united, as you can see there, for a little less than 200 years. What happened in 1127 was that a people called the Manchu, these were a non-Chinese people. They lived in what is today, Manchuria is today part of China, but it's in northeastern Asia. But these Manchus were steppe nomads, and a group of steppe nomads conquered northern China and ruled it. And they took the name the Qin Dynasty. They, like in years past, even though they were foreigners, they adopted Chinese culture as their own. So northern China was conquered by a Manchu dynasty, but the Sung Dynasty retreated and held on to power in the south. So you have the Sung Dynasty that would rule from 1127 to 1279, but only in the southern part of China, and along mainly the Yangtze River Valley. Now, the Sung Dynasty is very important in history because a couple of important things happened. First of all, because the civil wars had destroyed the system of redistribution, by the time you get to the Sung Dynasty, peasants now had outright ownership of their land. The old idea of redistribution was cast away, fell out of use, and so now peasants owned their own land. Their families owned their own property. Another thing was that the whole system of forced labor and payment in kind, that system fell by the wayside. To replace it, the Chinese adopted a money economy. You know, coinage had been around for a long time, but it was under the Sung Dynasty that you see the adoption of a money economy on a large scale. Now, the Chinese China has always been a country that has always had a shortage of precious metals. They didn't have gold or silver in large quantities, but they needed money. And so one of the things that came out of the Sung Dynasty was that they invented paper money. The Chinese invented paper during the Han Dynasty, paper from using wood pulp. But they also invented paper currency because the paper fiat money, in other words, this is saying this paper is worth this much gold. And the only reason why they invented paper money was because they had a shortage of precious metals to use to make coins. But anyway, the introduction of a money economy did some things for China. First of all, it led to the growth, for the really first time, of a very wealthy group of people engaged in trade and manufacturing. Now, up to this point, merchants and craftsmen basically had been state employees, and they had no standing and they were not very held in high regard. But as a result of the introduction of a money economy, if you were a merchant or a tradesman and you were successful, you could make a lot of money. Same thing if you were a prosperous farmer and if you were a good farmer, then you could accumulate land and property and wealth. So you start to see peasants and merchants and tradesmen during the Sung Dynasty actually make something of themselves because they could use the market economy and trade to accumulate wealth for themselves. Another thing about the Sung Dynasty was that it was a very productive period in terms of inventions. The Sung Chinese were very inventive people. They invented gunpowder. Gunpowder was invented by the Chinese. They invented the compass, which made sea travel a lot easier because you can know true north. You can know where you're going with the compass. They invented the astrolabe, which is a device where you use it to use the positions of the stars in the skies to determine your position, without your position without where you are. And so they invented they also, it was during this time that tea was, you always think of Chinese and tea. Well, tea was introduced at this time to China, so they became tea drinkers at this time. Cotton was introduced at this time. Peanuts, how many people eat Chinese food with peanuts? Peanuts weren't even introduced to China till this time period. And a lot of the introduction of cotton, tea, and peanuts were due to trade. Now that the Chinese were opening up themselves to trade, new products were being adopted and introduced to China. Also,
where did they originally come from?
You know what? I think cotton is. I think a lot of these products are from Africa, like
Cotton
India.
was in Egypt, I know.
Yeah, I think a lot of it came from as they expanded into the Indian Ocean. I think it would be like India and Africa that these products would come from. I mean, I'm not. You could probably look up Wikipedia and find out that information. So it was also that they were very good at creating. They invented new varieties of rice that were much more healthy, much more nutritious, and could grow faster. And they also invented some new ways of irrigation work too. And so as a result of these new agricultural products like peanuts and the introduction of new irrigation techniques and new varieties of rice, I mean, this did wonders for the Chinese population. The population grew very rapidly because there was much more food to eat during the Sung Dynasty. Another thing that happened politically was, and in terms of political history, was that during this period, since the aristocracy of Turkish folks had been destroyed by the Civil War, as a result of that situation, positions of bureaucracy were basically open to anybody. So anybody who had talent could rise up to the highest positions in the government. So you had a much more meritocratic system where you didn't have any one group having a monopoly of positions of power. So this opened up the bureaucracy to any Chinese. Now, the thing about the Chunzu is that usually it was, to be a Chunzu gentleman scholar, you had to go through all those years of education. So usually they were, in a sense, a social class, because usually if you were Chunzu, you would want to have your children also be Chunzu, so you train them. So Chunzu, the Chinese gentleman, was often hereditary. But the thing about it was that if you were a wealthy merchant or a craftsman or even a wealthy farmer, if you could use your resources to ensure that your son got that education, that son had the opportunity to join the Chunzu. You see? So the Chunzu was a class. It was basically the aristocracy of China, but it was always open to new members, because if any merchant or prosperous farmer gave their son the proper education, if that son passed the exams and learned and was able to enter the bureaucracy, he became Chunzu. So it was an aristocracy, but it was open to new members. Now, another thing that happened during this time period was that during the previous period of the Tang Dynasty, the emperor was kind of like the first among equals. You had this aristocracy during the Tang Dynasty of people of Turkish ancestry. But that aristocracy had been destroyed by the civil wars. So you had a situation in the Sung Dynasty where the emperor was above everybody else. The emperor was held up as being more powerful and more exalted than anybody else. He was no longer a first among equals. He was the exalted one, the son of heaven. And so there was this kind of more prestige and power and reverence for the emperor than any time. At the same time, you had this Chunzu that was more open to all classes of Chinese society. Now, the Sung Dynasty fell victim, both the Sung Dynasty and the Northern Manchu Qin Dynasty, both of these states fell victim to a new set of steppe nomads. And these would be the Mongols. Now the Mongols and the Manchu and the Turks are all what we call Altaic peoples. They all speak languages that are related to one another. And the Mongols lived in, well, Mongolia, to the north of China, in the steppes of Asia. And now normally the Mongols were divided up into numerous tribes. They're often at war with one another. But around about 1200 or so AD, the Mongol tribes found a very charismatic leader named Temujin. Now Temujin is better known to history as the Great Leader. Genghis means great, Khan means leader. Genghis Khan means great leader. And Genghis Khan was able to unite all the Mongol tribes under his leadership. And then he was a very successful military general, and he overthrew the Manchu dynasty in China. He also invaded Central Asia and defeated many of the Turkish tribes. Now the thing about the Mongols, though, is that it was called a horde. Just like previous steppe peoples, when they conquered a people, like when they conquered the Turks of Central Asia, they would say, look, come on, join us. We need some new members. If you're brave and you want to fight, if you like to plunder and kill and defeat cities, join the horde. So it was like if you were a successful horseman, you could join. So with every victory, the Mongol armies got bigger. Now the secret of success of the Mongols was that they were great horsemen. And this is, if you've ever ridden a horse, you can appreciate this. They were able to fire multiple arrows with great accuracy while riding a horse. And even, I've tried to ride a horse and I'm like, I've only done it a couple of times, with the kids, normally. And usually afterwards you're walking around like this for a couple of hours. You know how many people have ridden a horse before? Can you imagine being able to ride a horse and with your hands free, pull out arrows and actually be accurate? Can you imagine being able to do that? That's amazing. But if you were born on a horse and spent your whole life around horses and were riding horses from yay high to adult, probably you could be able to do it. But the Mongols, that was their secret. They would basically envelop, it's called flank. They would flank and surround their enemies and then just shoot them down with arrows. So they could just go, they could shoot and launch arrows at a very rapid pace. And sometimes they could do it even by going behind. The horse would be going this way, and they'd be shooting like this. So the horse is going one way, and you're shooting behind you and hitting your targets accurately. So it was pretty amazing.
Didn't they have like a special kind of bow?
They didn't have the bow. I don't know exactly what it was called, but I know that they had making a bow was a big deal. It took years to make every Turkish warrior, every Mongol warrior was very proud of his arrow, his bow and arrow. Now eventually what happened is that it would be the grandson of Genghis Khan, a man by the name of Kublai Khan, who, now the thing about the Mongols was that their empire expanded all the way as far as Poland in Europe and as far as Syria in Western Asia. But they had to set up a system where you had a great Khan or supreme leader. And Kublai Khan was the supreme leader of the Mongols. And it was he who conquered China. And supposedly the last Song emperor threw himself off a cliff into the Pacific Ocean as the Mongol armies approached and took over his kingdom. So it would be Kublai Khan who would conquer all of China by about 1260 AD. He also tried to conquer Japan. He sent a huge fleet to try to conquer Japan, and it was destroyed by a great storm. And that great storm was called the Kamikaze. And that's why when the Japanese were being attacked by the United States in World War II, they called the pilots the Kamikaze, the divine wind, because they remembered how this great storm had destroyed Kublai Khan's fleet when it tried to invade Japan back during the reign of Kublai Khan in the 13th century. But anyway, he also tried to conquer Vietnam, and he was unsuccessful. And during the Vietnam War, the Vietnamese were inspired by the fact that just as they had defeated Kublai Khan and driven out the Mongols back in the 13th century, they thought we can defeat the Americans, and they used the same tactics of guerrilla tactics to defeat the Mongols in the 13th century that they used against the Americans. Well, they didn't actually ever defeat the Americans. The Mongols did the same thing as the Americans. They said, "Hey, enough of this. This is crap. We're out of here." So anyway, Kublai Khan was, he was making historical, he invaded Vietnam, and people in Vietnam remembered that for centuries. He tried to invade Japan. People in Japan remembered that for centuries. The reason people remembered these events was because defeating Kublai Khan was a big deal, because the Mongols had the greatest empire that anybody could ever remember. An empire that stretched across Asia. And now Kublai Khan decided that he was going to be a Chinese emperor. So he adopted Chinese culture as his own. And now he didn't make any changes in the system that was already in place, except that under Kublai Khan, the most highest military positions were set apart for only Mongols. So only Mongols could hold the highest positions in the military. But other than that, he adopted the system that was already in place when he conquered China. So even though he was Mongol, he fully considered himself to be a Chinese emperor. And he is founder of the Yuan dynasty that would rule China for a little less than 100 years. Now, the biggest difference, the one big change in Chinese history that the Mongols introduced was that Kublai Khan decided to make the capital of China the city of Beijing, or Peking. Beijing and Peking are the same place. There's just different ways of transliterating Chinese characters. But he made a new capital, and the only reason why he made this capital the capital was he needed a capital in the north. He wanted to have a capital that would be further and north and close to Mongolia, where that was the center of his power. So that's why Beijing is in the far north. That's why they have snowstorms, and it's kind of the same climate as like Iowa. It's like cold winters, hot and humid summers. But anyway, and Beijing has remained the capital ever since of China. Now, another thing he did was that he further centralized government functions. So more and more power is in the hands of the emperor and his immediate officials. So there was a centralization of power. And that was just done so that he could maintain control. He wanted to make sure that trusted Mongols controlled the highest positions. But that centralization was continued by later Chinese dynasties. Now, the thing about the Mongols was that these military officials began to quarrel among themselves. After the death of Kublai Khan, the highest ranks of the Mongols began to struggle for power and fight among themselves, and that created an opening for the Chinese. The Chinese did not like being ruled by foreigners. And eventually a man by the name of Hong Wu would lead a peasant uprising and eventually drive out the Mongols, take control of Beijing, and found the Ming, or Brilliant Dynasty, in 1368. And I'm not going to go into details on that, because if you take World History 2, you get to learn about the Ming Dynasty. All right, so let's move on and talk about Japan. We haven't talked about Japan yet, but I want to talk about Japan. Japan's, now it's the number 3 economy in the world. So they own most of our debt, so I guess we should know something about them, since we owe them a lot of money. They own most of the real estate in Hawaii. Anyway, most of the hotels. They own.
Isn't that a twist of irony?
What? Yeah. And they thanks to them, the Tennessee economy has an auto industry. Nissan is located in Nashville, thanks to the Japanese. That's why our governor goes to Japan a lot.
Well, don't leave China out of the equation.
What?
You can't leave China out of the economic equation, huh?
Well, China and Japan. Now, let's talk about Japan. Now, the Japanese, you got to remember, they are related to Mongols and Manchus and Turks. They're Altaic peoples. And around 300 BC, Altaic peoples, they first entered Korea, and then they came into Japan. And so now in Japan, in Japanese history, that's why the warrior on horseback was important because it was a vestige of the fact that Japan was settled by people from the steppes of Asia who came in and settled in the islands beginning around 300 BC. Now, when they came there, they encountered a people still in the Stone Age. The Ainu were the indigenous people of Japan, the earliest inhabitants of Japan, and they were actually Caucasian. They were white people. And when the Japanese came in, the Ainu were either killed or intermarried with the incoming invaders. And today you can only find Ainu on a handful of islands in the far north part of Japan.
You said they're Caucasian?
Yeah, they're white. Yeah, and so Japan is one of these cases where Japan went from being in the Stone Age, in the Neolithic period, it went from Neolithic to iron and skipped completely to Bronze Age, because when the Altaic peoples came, they brought their iron tools and weapons with them. Now, during the Han Dynasty, Japan was still in a simple culture, and our Chinese sources refer to the Japanese as barbarians, still very warlike barbarians, tattooed and fighting among themselves, ruled by sorceress queens, queens who are witches. Now Japan, though, entered into became a complex culture during the Yamata period, which is the period from around 300 to 600 AD. Now, it was at this time that Yamato Plain is in central Japan, in around the area of what is today Tokyo. It's in central Japan. I think I have a map of Japan. See if I can get this map to work here. If you look at a map here, here's the Korean Peninsula, here's China, here's Japan, and the Yamato Plain here would be in the area around Tokyo. But in this area right here, this is the main island. I think it's Honshu. I think that is. The Ainu would be up in this area, up in the north. All right, now during the period of the Yamato period, the rulers of this area were able to establish their hegemony, their rule over most of the Japanese islands. And what's marked by the Yamato period is that the rulers, the kings, and they think queens. They think that Japan was a matriarchal society in the sense that you had women rulers. But in Japan, the rulers built these immense mounds to bury their kings. And so these mounds are huge. They're giant earthen structures, and these are where the Japanese rulers were buried. Now, during the Yamato period, a couple things happened that were important in Japanese history. First, they adopted much of Chinese culture as their own. So Confucianism was adopted through contact with the Han Chinese. Also, Buddhism entered Japan. Buddhism was introduced to Japan by Korean missionaries, and Buddhism was adopted by the Japanese. And along with Buddhism came Buddhist art. Remember, Buddhist art originated in northern India and influenced Chinese art, and now it influenced Japanese art. So with Buddhism came Buddhist sculpture and Buddhist art that had a big influence on Japan. Now, the thing about the Japanese was that when they adopted foreign influences, whether it be Confucianism or Buddhism, they never completely gave up their indigenous beliefs. Now, the Japanese, their indigenous religion is called Shinto. And Shinto is what we call animism. It's the belief that natural phenomenon are inhabited by spirits, whether it be mountains or rivers or lakes or the sun or the stars. And the Japanese believed that these spirits inhabiting the earth, inhabiting the mountains and the lakes and the trees, that these spirits were their ancestors. So honoring these spirits through sacrifices and prayers was not only honoring these spirits, but honoring their ancestors, the ancestors of their tribes and their people. So the Shinto cult was a form of ancestry. It combined worshiping nature with worshiping one's ancestors. And it was a very ancient cult. Now, when they adopted Buddhism, it was that Mahayana Buddhism that was very syncretic, it was very open. And so Japanese could be both Buddhists and still honor their Shinto cults at the same time. They could do both. And that was what they did. They were practicing Buddhists, but also they still worship their ancient Shinto religion at the same time. Now, according to Japanese tradition, the first emperor to unite all of Japan and to rule it was a man by the name of Temmu in 680 A.D. Now, according to tradition, Temmu is a direct ancestor of the current emperor of Japan. All Japanese emperors claim descent from Temmu. Now, Temmu, his ancestor was the sun goddess. Somebody might have a mountain or a forest, but his ancestor was the sun in the sky. And that's why, what is the symbol of, what is on the flag of Japan? The rising sun, because it symbolizes the emperor. The emperors of Japan weren't just men; they were descended from the sun goddess. They were divine. When they adopted much of Chinese culture, so that the Japanese emperor, like the Chinese emperor, was considered to be a divine figure, a figure of reverence, whose person was sacred. And also, one of the main jobs of the emperor was to honor all the different Shinto cults, to perform all the sacred rituals. So the emperor was kind of like a high priest in that regard, a person who was considered to be a person to be revered, and also a person who conducted these ancient Shinto cults. Now, the dynasty in Japan, they adopted the Tang system. They inherited, they could see over in Japan. So you had that system set up. The big difference, though, was that in Japan, positions in the bureaucracy were not based on merit as much as they were based on aristocratic birth. So positions in the government were held by powerful families. And also, instead of having an army that was made up of peasants who were recruited, you had an army of hereditary warriors, the samurai. Here's a samurai here with his sword and shield, sword and heavy armor. The samurai were a hereditary class of warriors, and they were under the rule of the emperor. So you had these samurai, in many ways, harken back to the days when the ancestors of the Japanese were on the steppes of Asia riding their horses. The samurai were expert horsemen and expert warriors, but it was hereditary. If your father was a samurai, you were a samurai. Now eventually, Kyoto or Heian became the capital of Japan, and that became the emperor's residence. And the period from about 794 to 1180 is known as the Heian period, from the capital of Japan. And this was the period when Japan was united and under the rule of the emperors. It was at this time also that the Japanese adopted Chinese characters and adapted it to their own language. Remember, Japanese spoke a very different language than Chinese. But they took Chinese characters and adapted it to their own language, and it's called kana. So eventually the Japanese adopted their own system of writing. Now, the thing about the Japanese is that they're very much influenced by Buddhism and by Confucianism. The one area where the Japanese excelled in, though, where they really made it their own, was in long narratives, long prose narratives, which we call the novel. The Japanese liked to tell long tales and write them down, and many times they even had women authors who would write in these long novels. Now, what distinguishes Japanese novels is they're usually erotic novels. They're basically about sex and people having romantic relationships and sexual relationships, and they would probably be considered dirty by our American puritanic standards. But that's the one area where the Japanese excelled in, were these long erotic novels that they wrote. But anyway, now in Japanese history, what happened, though, by the time you get to the 12th century, was that powerful aristocratic families were kind of positioning themselves and waging war against each other to see who would dominate the Japanese government. You still had an emperor, but over time the emperor became more and more of just basically a nominal figure, performing religious duties but having no real power. And power was in the hands of these aristocratic families. But they were always fighting among themselves and waging war against each other to see who would be dominant. Now, eventually what happened is that Minamoto Yoritomo, he was able to defeat all of his rivals. Now, he could never be the emperor because he wasn't of the imperial family. But he entitled himself shogun, which means commander-in-chief. And he became the first shogun of Japan. And he held all the cards. He had an army of samurai. He forced all the other aristocratic families to be his vassals, to do his bidding. And he united Japan after decades and decades of internal conflict. Now, he decided to make his capital at Kamakura. Now, what happened, though, was that Yoritomo was unable to establish a dynasty. Instead, members of his wife's family, the Hojo, were able to come to power, and they actually ruled as a dynasty. It's called the Hojo dynasty from 1217 to 331. So the position of shogun was held by the Hojo family for over a century. Now, some of the great aristocratic families did not like this situation. And so what happened is that a man by the name of Hashikaga Takagi, he led a group of nobles, and they defeated the Hojo, and Ashikaga was able to establish himself as shogun. Now, he established a much more formal system of government. And this is, some people often show that this system of government was very much like feudalism in Europe. See, under this system that Ashikaga established, he was the shogun, but every aristocratic family that was a vassal of his was a daimyo. A daimyo would be a regional noble, like the equivalent of a duke or a count in Europe. And the daimyo would have his own army of loyal samurai, but linked the daimyo to the shogun with these ties of loyalty, the equivalent to the lord and vassal situation that we see in Europe. So under this system, the daimyo would be, their children would be heirs, but they would also be vassals of the Ashikaga shogun. So it was a hereditary system, but it linked the shogun and the regional noble, the daimyo, through these ties of loyalty. And this system created order in Japan for over 100 years. And it's called the Ashikaga period. And it was also a period where Japan really began to prosper. It saw the introduction of a money economy, the development of trade, and merchant families and tradesmen were able to open up, and guilds were established for tradesmen in some of the market towns. So the Ashikaga period was very, overall, a prosperous time in Japanese history. All right. Well, we've gone for quite a long time here. Let's take a quick break. We covered Japanese and Chinese history in 50 minutes. So what I want you to do is, this is what I want you to do. All right. This as a review of what we just covered. Hopefully you're all taking notes. I want you all to think about, we talk about different periods of time. You know, how was the Song dynasty different from the Tang dynasty? How did the Song differ from the Tang? How was it a different dynasty, and how did it govern? How was China different in this period of the Song dynasty than it was in the Tang dynasty? All right. So this would be a way of just kind of reviewing your notes and kind of and do that while you finish up your folders. So we'll take a quick break, and then we'll go over that in about 5 minutes. All right, now before we leave Japan, I wanted to say something about Korea, because Korea is another one of those Asian giants that we hear about. You know, under our current administration, we're supposed to be pivoting away from the Middle East, focusing our diplomatic efforts on our Pacific partners. So anyway, but Korea. Let's talk about Korea. Is a lot like the Japanese history. A lot of similarities. The Koreans are also an Altaic people like the Japanese, in the sense they're not ethnically related to the Chinese. They're more ethnically related to Japanese. They're both descended from people from the steppes of Asia who came in and settled in the Korean peninsula. Another thing about the Koreans is that historically they've always been separated. You know, we think of North and South Korea as just a recent 20th century phenomenon, but Northern Korea has often been part of China, and Northern Korea is very mountainous, and Southern Korea is very has open plains and good for farming. So there's always been some differences there. Now, Korea was first united in this period. The kingdom of Silla united various different kingdoms and created a united Korea. Now, the kingdom of Silla, which was the first kind of Korean state, extended over much of what is today North and South Korea. And when it was created, it was they adopted the system of China in the sense that the Korean emperor, or Magapan, or Khan, or Mark Khan, you can see the name Khan, you can see their links to the Turks and the Mongols. But he was the emperor of Korea, just like you had a Japanese emperor and a Chinese emperor. And they adopted the bureaucratic system, the Confucian system that was in China. They adopted that in Korea. Now, another thing about Korea, just like in Japan, is that they embraced Buddhism. So Confucianism and Buddhism were both embraced by the Koreans. Also, they continued to worship their traditional religion, which was very much like Shintoism, in honoring, equating ancestors with natural phenomena, you know, mountains and lakes and streams. According to the it's kind of interesting, the family that rules North Korea today. This is interesting. They claim to be descended from this great mountain, and the mountain is an old Korean spirit. So it's kind of funny how they've equated, they're communists, but the great leader is descended from one of the ancient gods worshipped by the Koreans. So they kind of linked their ancient past with their modern system in North Korea. But anyway, so Korea and Japanese, they're both influenced by traditions that came from China, but also by Buddhism. All right, let's talk a little bit about, in the remaining time, I think we're going to have time to talk about the steppes and India. Now, what we see happening in the steppes of Asia was that, remember the Abbasid dynasty, by defeating China, opened up Central Asia to Islam. And the Turkish peoples of Central Asia, they adopted Islam as their religion. But over time, with the decline of the Abbasids, what you see happening in parts of Iran and Central Asia was that local Arab rulers established emirates. And you had by about 900 AD, you had the Samanid Emirate established in what is today Iran and Afghanistan in Central Asia. But eventually what happened is that ethnic Turks who had adopted Islam began to carve out empires for themselves. Now, in the steppes of Asia, what we often see happening is that a very charismatic leader, warrior leader, will unite the tribes and become a great force. And such a person was Sebuktigin, about 1000 AD. He was a very charismatic warlord. He united a bunch of Turkish tribes. And what he did, though, was that he declared a jihad against the Hindu peoples of Pakistan and northern India. And he in the name of jihad, he advanced into these areas, and he really introduced Islam to Pakistan and northern India. But these wars and these raids against the Hindu Rajputs or Rajas enabled him to acquire great wealth by these wars that he fought in northern India. But he established an empire that's known as the Ghaznavid Empire that would be the strongest force in Central Asia for about 2 centuries in Iran, Afghanistan, and Pakistan and northern India. And it was during this time that many Hindus converted to Islam. Think about it this way. When they advanced into northern India, let's say you're a low caste Shudra or an untouchable who's low caste and nobody in Hindu religion, in Hindu society. All you had to do convert to Islam, and you were like the ruling class. And so that's why even to this day there are some 200 million Muslims who live in India today. But so Islam advanced into India thanks to the jihad by the Ghaznavid sultans, Ghaznavid rulers. Now, a contemporary of Sepukchedin would be a man by the name of Togrul Beg. He would be another Turkish, and he's the founder of the Seljuk dynasty of Turks. Now, the Seljuk Turks, they originated in Central Asia, and Togrul Beg was a very charismatic warlord and assumed the title Sultan. And the Seljuk Sultans, though they advanced from Central Asia, and they're the ones who defeated the Byzantine at the Battle of Manzikert, and they established themselves, by 1055, they had established themselves in Mesopotamia, and they would advance into Syria and Asia Minor, and establish the Seljuk Empire. Remember, the arrival of the Seljuk Turks, when that empire collapsed soon after, that would be the chaos that would invite the Crusaders into the Holy Land by the end of the 11th into the 12th century. Couple things about it. Remember Saladin, who we already discussed. One of the reasons why he was so successful is that he was actually a Kurd from northern Iraq, but he was a very charismatic warlord. He got a lot of Turks who had moved into the area to unite under his leadership, and he was the one who in 1187 retook Jerusalem for Islam, and he actually established a dynasty called the Ayyubids. I think that's how you say it. And they were people descended from Turks and Kurds, but they ruled over much of Syria, Palestine, and Egypt. The Saladin actually overthrew the last Fatimid caliph of Egypt and established his rule over Egypt. Now these Ayyubid rulers, they continued to recruit for their armies. They recruited Turks and people from the Caucasus, people from what is today Dagestan and Ossetia and Georgia and what is the area between the Black and the Caspian Seas and what is today southern Russia and this area. And they recruited heavily from this area. And often they would recruit, they would buy up slaves who were non-Muslims and convert them to Islam. And they created a slave army. The Ayyubids, their warriors, their professional warriors, were slaves of the Sultan. They were called Mamluks. Well, this is a great story. The Mamluks, who were the slave warriors of the Ayyubids, they got tired of taking orders. They got tired of being the ones who were under the Ayyubid rule. So in 1250, this is what they did. They overthrew the last Ayyubid, and they declared from this point onward they would elect one of their own to be the new Sultan. And so you had a whole series for the next 300 years in Egypt and Syria and that area. You'd have Mamluk sultans who would rule over this area, and they were elected. The army, the knights, the warriors, they weren't knights, but the warriors would elect one of their own when the old sultan died to be the next sultan. But they were great warriors, and many of them were of Caucasus, Circassian it's called, that area, in Georgia, Dagestan, that area, they were recruited and raised in that area and brought to Egypt. Now, I mentioned the Mamluks because the Mamluk sultans were one of the only people to successfully defeat the Mongols. The Mongols went on a tear. When after, it wasn't just Genghis Khan, but his descendants in the 13th century. You got to remember, they weren't just conquering China. They were conquering Central Asia. They advanced into Russia. They conquered Russia in the 13th century and forced all the Russians to be their slaves and to pay them tribute. They advanced into Poland, and they killed they massacred the people. Poland was so decimated by the Mongols that the kings of Poland had to ask Jews to settle there. I mean, they put out a call. There were all these Jews in Germany who were suffered persecution, and the kings of Poland in the 13th century, because of the vast toll that Mongols had taken on them, they invited as many Jews who wanted to live there. They said, "We'll give you religious freedom. You can have your own government. Come on down." And thousands and thousands and thousands of Jews settled in Poland, and they were there till the Nazis killed them. for centuries. Most of the world's Jews lived in Poland up until the Holocaust, or they lived in Russia when Poland took over Russia in the 14th and 15th, 16th century. All right, now, but the Mamluks, though, they successfully defeated the Mongols. Hulagu Khan was another grandson of Genghis Khan. He would have been a contemporary of Kublai Khan. He was leading Mongol armies, and they conquered Iran, and they advanced into Syria, and in Syria, the Mamluk Sultan was able to stop it. It was the only time the Mongols actually suffered a defeat. And it had a big impact on Hulagu, because up to this point, he'd been pagan. The Mongols were pagans. They worshipped spirits. They worshipped the same type of religion you see in Korea and Japan, honoring the cults of nature and having kind of an ancestor worship. But the story is that after he was defeated by the Mamluks, Hulagu said, "Oh, well, this shows that the Muslim God must be the supreme God," and he converted to Islam. It was his defeat by the Mamluks that made him convert to Islam. Now, Kublai Khan never converted to Islam, but his cousin, Hulagu Khan, converted to Islam after his defeat by the Mamluks. Now, probably a good reason why he converted to Islam, besides being defeated by the Mamluks, was that most of his realm that he ruled included Iran and Afghanistan, where the majority of the population were already Muslims. Now, by the time you get to the 13th century, see if I can get this map to work here, the Mongol Empire was huge. It stretched from the Pacific all the way to almost to the Mediterranean. So you had these different khanates. One in Russia called the Golden Horde, the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, Hulagu's empire in Iran and Afghanistan, and of course here's Kublai Khan's dynasty here in China. But it was a massive empire, all held together by the Mongols. Now, it didn't last very long, though.
Is it because of its open borders?
Well, it didn't last very long because it's hard to keep an empire of such huge, without computers and motorized vehicles and trains. It's hard to keep such an empire together, and it collapsed soon afterward. But Hulagu was able to establish an empire that his dynasty lasted for a little over a century. Now, the thing about the Ilkhanid Empire, and this was true of the Ghaznavid Empire as well, is that even though they were Mongols, much of their population was Iranian, and Persian was already an established language of literature and scholarship, and so the Ilkhanids adopted much of Persian culture, and Persian became the language of the court. And eventually the Khans referred to themselves as Shahs. Shah is the Persian word for king. So even though they were Mongol in ancestry, they were Persian in culture over time, because much of the population of their empire were Iranians. Now, the last great steppe conqueror, though, was a man by the name of Tamerlane, or Timur the Lame. He was called Timur the Lame because he was lame. One foot was shorter than the other. They found his tomb not too long ago, and they found his body, and they dug it up, and they found out that one leg was shorter than the other. But you know what? Being lame and walking like this isn't a problem when you're always on a horse, is it? You got to remember, he was a Turk, and he was, he lived on his horse, so it didn't matter that he couldn't walk. And then the guy was on his horse all the time. But Timur the Lame was the last great charismatic warlord who was able to unite the Turkish tribes of what is today, I think it was Uzbekistan in that area, and unite all these Turks, and he went on a tear. And just like the Mongols before him, he created a huge empire. He conquered northern India, he conquered Asia Minor, he conquered Mesopotamia, and over time, by the time of his death, you can see his empire stretched from Central Asia all the way to Anatolia and Mesopotamia. Huge empire here, all in green. Now, eventually, he established a dynasty that would rule over Iran until 1494. But just like the Ilkhanids before him, his descendants adopted Persian as their language of their court, and that became the language of government and of their culture. And so now there's a lot of in the last closing minutes, there's a lot of overlap between the history of Central Asia and India, because periodically these steppe peoples would cross the Hindu Kush Mountains into the Indus River Valley, and eventually further south into the Ganges River Valley. And we saw this with the Ghaznvids, how they waged war against the Rajputs. Rajputs were the descendants of the Huns, who had conquered India, northern India, back in the 5th century A.D. And these Rajputs were Hindus, and they're always being attacked by the Muslims. And there was this constant war, because as pagans, as people not of the book, it was the job of, in Sharia law, good Muslim rulers had to wage war against these heathens. So there was constant war going on. Now, eventually what happened is that a group of Iranian and Turkish warriors from what is today Afghanistan, they crossed over and established a permanent foothold at a place called Delhi. Delhi today is still the capital of India, but Delhi was founded by Muslim Turks and Iranian tribesmen. And what they did is they established themselves at Delhi, and they converted many people to Islam in northern India, but they also forced Rajputs, Rajas, if they paid tribute, could maintain their control as long as they paid taxes and tribute to the Sultan of Delhi. And this Sultan of Delhi would last for over 300 years. What happened, and what happened over time was that the Muslims there did not want to use the Hindu text. They didn't want to use that Sanskrit for their writing system because it was dirtied by being associated with Hinduism. So they developed their own language called Hindustani, their own written script, Hindustani, which was heavily influenced by Persian. They took the Persian script and the Persian language, and they adapted it to the Hindustani spoken by the common people of India. But I mentioned this, and this is where it gets scary. For years and years, Muslims and Hindus were at war with one another. Now, when eventually the British would take over, you learn about that in world history too. But when India gained its independence from Great Britain, there was this huge divide, and Pakistan was created by Muslims, Indians, and India is Hindu. Now, a lot of Muslims, there are still some Muslims who still live in India today, but there was a huge gap. But those ancient rivalries and those ancient antagonisms still exist. And ever since the 1990s, what's gotten scary is that both sides have nuclear weapons now. So you have two countries who historically hate one another, going back centuries, and now they're both armed with nuclear weapons. Now, now we're threatened with another situation in Western Asia, where you have Shiite Iran trying to get nuclear weapons, and now they're talking about the Saudi Arabians, who are Sunnis, trying to get nuclear weapons. So we might have a standoff between Sunnis and Shia in Western Asia, just like we have a standoff between Pakistani Muslims and Hindu Indians in Central Asia. So, and these rivalries and conflicts go back after 6 centuries. Now, it's important to remember, and I will close at this point, was that southern India, the extreme southern parts of India, were never conquered by the Muslims, and they remained loyal to their Hindu religion. But the people who live in southern China are called Tamil, and they speak a completely, it's not even an Indo-European language, it's a pre-Indo-European language, Dravidian language. And that you have the Chola Empire continued to exist. And what happened, and I'll close here, is that in Southeast Asia, over time, either Muslim or Hindu missionaries were able to extend their influence. And that's why when you get into Southeast Asia, like if you might have like Java, which is predominantly Hindu, and where other parts of the other islands in Indonesia, like Borneo or Sumatra, might be predominantly Muslim. But it goes back to the fact that India was divided between Muslims and Hindus, and that division was extended by trade into contact into Southeast Asia. All right. Well, I did the best I could trying to cover everything. So I'll see y'all on Wednesday for the exam. Oh, thank you. Bring up your folders too. Yeah, thank you.
I don't know if he said anything about
I've got some questions too.
Well, you don't have to.
Oh, we don't?
No, if you're doing like if you do it like I think you sent me an email saying you were doing like an archaeology, you found something about archaeological discovery. If it's a recent archaeological discovery, all you have to do is link that discovery with some culture that we studied in class. You don't have to link it to modern current
Okay.
things.
Mine's about like Nebuchadnezzar and Babylon.
Now, did you find an article that talked about that? Okay, well then
About like how it might the main gardens might be Nineveh instead.
Okay, well that was in the news recently. So what you can do is use that talk to link it to studying those cultures.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay, good. All right. Which one are you doing now?
Come on, guys.
Yeah, I'm going there. Sure. We close up here. I'll be there in a minute.
You need to fill up.
the daily occurrence.